So I wanted to talk about how can estimators set themselves up to work remotely. I know that there's several pre-con teams that are working from their houses, working from apartments. They're not sitting right next to their coworker. So how can they go about setting themselves up to be successful?
So I think there's a number of things that you got to think through. Everything from how the software is configured to what your office environment is to how big your bandwidth is. So in terms of the software setup, you can host Estimator on your local machine. So IT can completely set it up so that you can work remotely on your own. That's one way of doing it. Obviously, that works if you're the only one in an estimate. If you are going to work with others on an estimate, there's really two ways that you can configure your estimating platform to allow you to do that. One is to host the jobs database on your own server. The second is to house it outside of your own network. If you host it, I almost said hose it. If you host it,
Don't hose it.
if you host it in your own network, you obviously need to have a VPN connection or a way of tunneling through your firewall so that your employees can get to the database. We have a number of customers who are actually going outside of their own network for a number of reasons, but particularly as it relates to working remotely, housing it up in the cloud. There's a number of providers, obviously Amazon and Microsoft and Google, and you name the flavor, but all of those enable you to get to your jobs database. So one thing to probably think through in connection with that, we actually ran into this morning with a customer, and that is your own internet connection to your house. So a lot of IT folks talk about, we have huge bandwidth to our data center, whether that be you hosting it or working with a cloud provider. That is often the case. The challenge is usually not the bandwidth to the server. Usually the bandwidth is from your house out. And we have a number of employees who have paid for higher bandwidth. The challenge when lots of people are working remotely is that there's no guarantee that you're going to get that bandwidth. So one of the customers we were talking with this morning had purchased 100 megabytes of up and down, and they were getting in the single digits. Obviously, the more people that work remotely, the more challenging that becomes. So those are things to think through.
Well, so I want to quickly talk about that. So you talked about VPN, and if we're having bandwidth issues, whether database is in the cloud or if it's on a VPN, I mean, they're still going to have a little bit of a lag time there, correct?
Okay, so specifically, do you want me to talk specifically to Estimator?
You can talk to the estimator, to estimating platform, whatever.
Yeah. So specifically with our solution Estimator, we have designed the product so that the user should not feel a lag. There is there's sort of two parts. There's working, where the user should not feel a lag, and then there is writing the data to the database, and the user controls when they write that data through saves and refreshes. There definitely could be delays associated with the save, but you control when that save is. So you could do it when you're getting up to go for a break. You can do it at lunchtime. You can do it at the end of the day. So trying to enable you to continue to work, but not have to deal with those bandwidth challenges really is something we've taken into account with the design of our product. Other products, that may or may not be the case. Obviously trying to figure out when the bandwidth feels slow is another tactic. So for example, we had a conversation last week internal to Beck Tech about when our guys were feeling like it had been throttled back, and we found that in our area, middle of the afternoon was the worst. So adjusting your working times to account for that, whether that's getting up early in the morning or working late at night, trying to find ways to work around whatever slowdowns you're experiencing. Sort of my third point about office is kind of the same thing. You know, one of the big challenges when you're working remotely in pre-con is it is heads down.
Mhm.
And you know, there are times where you want to be isolated, and obviously working remotely can be challenging when you have kids and spouses who are also trying to do the same thing. And you know, if you're in a situation where you have young kids or kids in general, they can be loud. If you have a spouse who is on the phone, that can be distracting. So again, kind of that same rule about trying to find the time that works best, both from an internet and from a family, and sharing the office potentially with a spouse is also a good kind of thing to think through.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of students right now being homeschooled and they're being asked to do online classes, that's also going to affect bandwidth for parents that may need to be doing work stuff too. So I think that's a good reminder of pick and choose your battles, but also pick and choose when is the right time to pull stuff off the VPN or the cloud.
Yeah, and I think there is this perception that you have to be online all the time. I think you know, when you work remotely, there are going to be times when you need to be online, and everyone else needs to be online. And there are going to be distractions and there are going to be challenges. But I think there are other times that you control when you don't need to be online, and you can pick and choose kind of how you work and the challenges that you face. I think it's really being um, you know, preemptive and knowing that you're going to run into challenges, and trying to think those through as best as you can. And then when you do hit challenges, taking a step back kind of from the firing line and going, is there an alternative way for me to continue to be effective, but not necessarily fight everyone else, whether that be in your house or on the internet, to get done what you need to get done. I think it's just thinking differently.
And I think that leads us into the next topic of um, over communicating with your team. So right now you're not able to just, hey, Jim Bob, I have a question about this estimate that's come in, or, you know, what specifically are we needing to deliver at this time on this date? So whenever you can't just turn around and have that freedom of just asking someone, can you talk a little bit about the importance of over communicating with your peers, your customers, and how can we do that effectively?
Yeah, I think it goes back to my earlier point, as you said. I think it's thinking through how you need to communicate and when you need to communicate and the channels in which you're communicating. You know, if you look at Beck Tech and what we've done, there are certain tools that we use for video conferencing, and there's obviously different flavors of those. And then there's also tools that we use for chatting, and we have our particular flavor of it. We still use email, we still use text, we still pick up the phone. Those are sort of like the tools, but then the way that you use those tools, I think you need to think through. So in my role, where we have, you know, 60 plus people, it's not just mass emails, sort of one way. I try and be very deliberate about every day I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to have those one-to-one conversations that I used to have in person in the office, whether that's, you know, walking by my desk or me walking past their desk, or jumping in to grab a coffee and you meet somebody in the kitchen. I think it's really important that you don't just make it a one-way dialogue. I think it needs to be a two-way dialogue, and being very thoughtful and thinking through a plan to make sure that you don't lose the things that you know, make us human, those one-to-one conversations. And just checking to see if people's families are okay, and that they're you know, they're not stressed out about working remotely and not having, you know, social interaction, and just helping them help themselves. So I think working remotely can be very effective, but it just requires you to be a little bit more thoughtful about how you do it and when you do it and the channel that you use to do it. And then I also think another thing that Julie, you're probably one of our better folks at doing this, is try to bring humor. I mean, you know, it is definitely a human trait that humor is a huge stress reliever. And when you are working remotely, you are under unique stresses associated with doing that. So um, everything from playing around with virtual backgrounds on video conferencing, everything to cracking a joke, everything to continue to pick on those people that like to be picked on. And I think that that's really, really important for working remote.
Well, and I'm going to say this for anyone that's watching the video. If you would like to see the unique backgrounds, Stuart is king of unique backgrounds, and you are welcome to reach out to him and have a video conference with him, and he can show you there we go. There's the royal family. That Stuart is very, Stuart, that's great. It's funny. My go-to weapon for awkward times is to use humor, and so I should just like this time. I felt like I should be a stand-up comedian, and would probably retire early from doing stand-up comedian. I'm sure stand-up comedians, that's what they do, is that they retire early, right?
Something like that.
Something like that.
I think another thing worth sharing is the act of sharing goes a long way. Yeah. So I think, when you work remotely, as we mentioned earlier, are these unique challenges. We all love our kids, but they can be challenging when you need to make a conference call. And coming up with ways that work for you, and not just keeping them to yourself, but sharing them with others in the office. I think that has been something that has helped all of us out. Julie, you, again, giving credit where credit's due, you're really good about sharing ways to be entertained, top 10 ways of entertaining your kids. We have some employees who probably fit in that kid category that could probably benefit from being entertained also. But, sharing and what works, share, but don't be afraid to share what doesn't work for you. It may work for somebody else. So I think that's another big part that I think makes Beck Tech unique, but I also think it's things that could be applied to other companies. We're willing to share what works and what doesn't work, and have fun doing it. So
I'm gonna jump back, because I think it kind of goes into that. What do we do during what feels like a downtime, but also if it's, hey, it's best for me to pull stuff off the VPN early in the morning, late in the evening, and now it feels like I have a chunk of my day where I feel like I should be productive, but maybe I'm, the bandwidth issue is causing a problem, or it feels like I'm not as busy as I once was in the office, because either I don't have the distractions of meetings, or all of a sudden I don't have an hour and a half commute every day. And so I've got an hour and a half back. So what do I do? So what can pre-con professionals do with this extra time? And we've talked a lot about where they can be working on the business instead of in the business. So do you want to give some tips of what they could be doing to work on the business?
I think I'll give some tips on working on the business, and I think that then there's tips for themselves. I think it is important, and everyone at Beck Tech's heard me saying this in general, even before having to throw in working remotely. Doing some things for yourself is not selfish. I think there's also challenges with working remotely where there is this underlying feeling of guilt, like I'm not doing enough, or hey, I'm with the kids, and that's wrong. It is not wrong. It is part and parcel of, to your point, you're not in the car driving to and from work. You're not typically in as many meetings. That's maybe the case, maybe not the case. I feel like I'm in non-stop meetings, but
what can they do to be working on the business instead of in the business?
Yeah, so obviously there's the pieces you just talked about the personal side, and being able to do things for yourself, take an online class, read a book, go work out. I think you may have to be creative on some of the things that you do when you're working remote, but you need to keep doing the things that keep you sane. And I think working out and doing things for yourself is definitely part of that. I think there's also, working on the business instead of in the business. So we talked earlier about, being able to continue to do estimates and projects. That's going to happen. The other thing that you can do if you get extra time as a result of not having to drive, or, not having to sit in the meetings, is to actually start to work on things that affect everybody working on the business. So things like going back through and looking at old projects and making sure those old projects have project properties that you can use for historical purposes, and bringing those in so that you have a richer set of data for historical cost purposes. Another thing that you can do is use the opportunity to go in and clean up your unit price database. So whether that's, update unit prices, add additional WBS properties, remove, line items that you don't use anymore.
This sound, these sound like all the projects of, we always say, whenever I have time, someday I'll get to it. So it's like, if you have that list of someday projects, hey, it's someday.
Yeah, I always feel like there's never enough time. And to your point, someday is this day. And I think if, again, kind of like to our point earlier about, planning, I think it's not just arbitrarily go off and do something. It's trying to figure out what's the things that you've needed to get to that you either avoided or just never had the time to do, and try and prioritize those in an order that you come out of this working remote or being forced to work remote into something positive for the business happens as a result of that. And I'd kind of apply the same thing on a personal level. Set some short-term personal goals, set some short-term professional goals, and try and find time every day to make sure that you're moving the ball forward.
I think that's great. I mean, I think I spent a couple of hours yesterday cleaning up. Does it make me feel better that, hey, we've gotten, 600 contacts cleaned up? And yeah, that's real good. So I think anytime, because again, I think this moment that we're in isn't going to last forever. And it's going to be like, man, we always say, if I had a week to work on something, what would I do? And so like, this is that time to figure that out. So I think going through cleaning up even like cost estimate databases, the naming conventions, we actually have a blog post that's going to be coming out of people going, I don't even know what it should be. What's a good standard? Beck Tech is going to help people figure out, hey, here's some suggestions for standards. And then also too, collecting the data for cost history. So within Beck Technology and really becoming the company for pre-construction data lifecycle, it's what can we do with this cost history data? And it's not just snap your fingers and it's there. It does require some digging so that you're making sure that you're collecting the right data. And this is the perfect time for companies wanting to get into that, to start to absorb that data, that information, clean it up so that you're making sure that you're looking at the right stuff.
I also think along that same line, like thinking through training, we provide training to our customers, but it's more button click training and how to use the product training. I think thinking about the standards that you want and the processes that you want your team and your company to follow. And then thinking about training, thinking about retraining, thinking about onboarding future employees. Now is the time to really think about the things that have been problems in the past that will be problems again in the future, and dedicate the time to try and address them and come out of this forced working remote in a better spot than you went in. But I also think working remote has been a thing for certain sectors of the economy. I think it's going to become more and more the norm. So a lot of this thinking differently, you will have more time, I think, is going to be something that's going to be with us on a go forward basis. And I think this way of thinking about working on yourself, working in the business, working on the business, those are the three tenets that I think we can all learn from and come out of this with things that make us and our businesses and our families better as a result of all of this.